Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the fifth video in the SwiftData series, and the second in this section. In this video, I want to introduce you to a one-to-many relationship for our books that's going to allow us to add multiple pull quotes for each of our books. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If you're following along with me, you can continue on with the project from video 4. If not, please download the completed project from the correct branch for this project's repository. And that's the fourth video _ lightweight migration branch. I'll leave a link in the description. For this video, I've started a new branch for one-to-many relationships. You should also make sure that you have at least 3 book entries in your app when you run it on the simulator. I also suggest that you run your application once and use the URL to open the location of that container's set of files and make a duplicate copy of those 3 files. I have already done that. Keep both of those windows available, as we'll be returning to them later. We are now at the point where I want to add more features to my app. Plus, I also want to make sure that if I already have users, they don't lose any data that they've already entered. Thankfully, if we are careful, we know that the SwiftData lightweight migrations can handle that for us. The first relationship I want to add is known as a one-to-many relationship. When I read a book, I like to pull quotes from that book and keep track of them. Each book can have many of these pull quotes, and that's why it's called a one-to-many relationship. So for this quote, I'm going to need to create a new model that we can persist in our data store in our SQLite database. So I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it quote. And I'll import SwiftData. Next, I'll create a new class called quote, and I'm going to make sure that I apply the model macro. This quote's going to have 3 properties. The first one is going to be a date that it was created that we'll provide as the date.now. We're going to have one that's called text, which will be the text of the quote, and that's a string. And another one that will be a page number should I choose to add it. So I'm going to make it optional. We'll need an initializer. So when I create this initializer, I don't really need this one for the date because I'm defaulting it to date.now. So I'm going to remove it. Well, we'll need to somehow establish a relationship between our 2 models, book and quote. Well, SwiftData supports both implicit and explicit creation of these relationships. So let's start with the implicit and see what SwiftData does. Back in our book model, I'm going to add a new property called quotes that will be an array of these quote. Now this is going to establish the relationship from book to quote, and we'll need to either provide a default value like an empty array or make it optional. My preference would be to make it an empty array, but I know that I want to explore CloudKit in the future, and we'll find a requirement there that this must be optional. Now there's no need to alter our initializer though, because when we create a new book, there won't be any quotes, so the default being a nil for this optional quote is just fine. And then back in quote file now, we can set a relationship back to our book. And we do this by creating a book of type book, and this has to be optional. So what we're saying here is that each quote may have a book associated with it, and if there is, there's only one. You may wonder how a quote cannot have a book associated with it. Well, we'll get to that shortly. I also want to give you a warning here, though, that even though the above may work, sort of, there's going to be an issue that we will resolve by the end of this video, so keep watching. Back at our app starting port where we created our container, we created a schema that only specified the book model in the array, and you may think that you should now add quote.self to this array here too. And if we were using the model container for initializer with this variadic parameter, perhaps we should add the comma and quote.self here too. Well, the answer is no. With SwiftData, since our book has a relationship to quote, it's smart enough to know that and will create our table in our database the first time it finds it, and the context will be aware of that table thereafter. So let's prove that by running our app now. Even though we added a new model to our database and we added new properties, SwiftData's lightweight migration, which we learned about in the last video, handled it just fine and our app launched. Now, if I locate that SQLite database from that URL in the console and open it with our SQLite browser application, you can see here that there is a new quote table created. And if we browse the data for our quote, you'll see that there's a field here added for book, but no records have been entered. That makes sense. When we browse the data for our book, though, we'll see no mention of the quotes array. So let's create a way for us to add some books and see how this all works. I want to create a view that will not only allow us to view all quotes for a book, but also allow us to add new ones, or delete them, or even edit existing ones. The view is actually pretty basic, but there are quite a few conditional views here. So let's create a SwiftUI file and call it quote list view. Since we'll be updating and inserting data, I'm going to need access to the context from the environment, so I'll need an environment property for that, which is the environment keypath model context that I'll call model context. Now, since we want to be viewing all quotes for a particular book when we reach this view, we'll have tapped on a button in our edit view that we have yet to create that will pass that book to this view. So let's create a constant for that book, which is of type book. Our preview complains now because we don't have a book. And if we want to be able to test this view in our preview, we'll need to use our preview container to add books to the preview in memory. So create a property for that. We'll need to pass in the book.self to our preview instance. And we'll need to access one particular book as we design our application. So first, let me establish an array of books as our books.samples. And now I can use that array and the preview add examples function to add that and insert them. Then we can return our quotes list view, providing one of those books. So I'm going to use book at index 4. And then we can apply the model container function using that preview container. I'm going to be getting to this view by way of a navigation stack, so let me embed the preview in a navigation stack so that we might be able to see any titles that it might add. Well, our quote creation date will be created automatically and it can't be changed. So we don't need any properties for that. But when we create or edit, a page and quote text will be required. And we're going to use text fields for that. So I'm going to create two state properties for those two book properties and initialize them as empty strings. Because pages don't always have to be numbers. They can be like 1A, 2A, or some indices use Roman numerals. Well, as mentioned, we're going to be using the view for displaying a list of existing quotes. So if I tap on one in the list, I may want to edit and update the content. So I'm going to create two more properties. The first will be a state property for the selected quote. That's the one that I tapped on. But if I haven't tapped on any yet, it doesn't exist. So it's an optional quote. And then I'm going to use a simple computed property called isEditing that will be a Boolean property that will simply return whether or not selected quote is not equal to nil. So if I'm editing, it's not nil. Now I have everything I need now to create my view. So I'm going to replace the body here with a group box where we're going to create our two text fields for both adding and editing. Inside the group box, I'll create an H-stack, and for the first item, I'll create a labeled content view that gives me the ability to create a title key and a content. For the title key, I'll just use the string page. For the content, I'll create a text view where the title key is the string page number, and it's going to be bound to our page state property. We're going to allow both numbers and texts, as some pages, like in indices, are not numeric. But we want to make sure that we don't get autocorrection. So let's make sure that this is disabled. And let's set the text field style to rounded border. And I'll set the frame to a width of 150 and then add a spacer. After the spacer, I'd like to create two buttons, but the first one is only displayed if we are editing, and it's going to be the cancel button that will just simply clear our fields. So for the action, we'll just reset the page and text to empty strings and set selected quote back to nil. And let me set that button style to bordered. The second button's label will depend on whether or not we are editing. So if we are editing, the string I'll use will be update, else it'll be create. And then for the action, if we are editing, we just want to update the selected quotes properties. So our selected quotes text will be equal to text. The selected quotes page will depend on whether or not page is empty. If it is empty, we'll make it nil. Otherwise, we'll assign the contents of that page variable. And then we'll set page and text both back to empty strings and set selected quote back to nil. Well, if we're not editing, we must be adding, so we can create an else statement here. We'll need to create a new quote using our initializer, but remember our page is optional. So we really have two different ways to construct a new quote, one with just the text and the other with both text and page. So I'm going to create a ternary operator here that will depend on if page is empty. If it is, we'll simply create a quote using the text argument. Else, I'll provide both text and page. Well, we have our book that is passed in, and it has an optional array of quotes. So I can use an append function on that optional array to append that new quote. And then I can reset the text and page back to an empty string. For the button, let's set the style to a bordered prominent style. And also, let's disable it if our text is empty. Since we still need a text view to allow us to create or edit the text, for this then, below the H stack, I'm going to create a text editor bound to that text variable. Then I'll set the border to a secondary color and apply a frame of a height of 100. Then finally, let's apply some horizontal padding to the entire group. Well, now that we have our add edit field set up, let's create a list view to display any existing quotes and provide a way to select one of them for editing or swipe to delete. So let's start with a list, but inside there we'll use a for each loop because I do want to use that delete function. The quotes that I want to display are the quotes that are the property of our passed in book. The problem is that I don't know the sort order. So let me create a computed property that will be sorted quotes. That will be the result of sorting the book.quotes optional array by using the key path comparator for the quote.creation date. And since quotes is optional, the sorted quotes will be optional as well. So if that's the case, I'll assign an empty array. So now it's no longer an optional property. Now we can use a for each loop on these sorted quotes. And since it's a SwiftData model, it's already identifiable. So I don't need to provide an ID, but it will provide me with a quote that I can use to display my information. So let me create first a VStack where the alignment is leading. And inside the VStack, I'll start with a text view displaying the quote.creation date. But this is the date, so I'll need to specify a format as .datetime. But I can also go further now and specify three more properties: the month, the day, and the year. I'll set the font to a caption font, and the foreground style I'll set to secondary. I'll follow that then with a text view displaying the quote text. Next, I'll want to display the page number, but only if quote.page is not optional or if the page property itself is not empty. So first I'll create an H stack, and then I'm going to add a spacer to push it to the right. Next, I'll use an if let page equals quote.page to unwrap it, but also check if not page is empty to determine if I need to add this page. If those conditions are met, I can create a text view displaying the string page followed by the page using the string interpolation. Now, if I want to be able to edit, I'll need to tap on one of these selected rows and set the selected quote to that corresponding quote. So in order to make sure that the entire row is a target for tapping, I'm going to use the content shape and set it to rectangle. And now I can create a on tap gesture. In the closure then, we'll set the selected quote to the quote that was tapped on. And then I'll set the text state property to be assigned the quote's text. The page state property will be assigned to the quote page, but it's optional. So we can use an empty string if it was. Now the final piece of the puzzle is to delete a text when we swipe on it. So we'll need an onDelete modifier for the for each item, and that's going to provide us with an index set. We can perform our deletion then within an animation block. Then we can loop through each index set using index set for each. That'll provide us with the index. And then we can use that in finding out if the quote is the one in our book.quotes at that index. If it is, then we'll use the context to delete the quote. Remember, we created that environment variable that we called model context. Let's set the list style to plain and provide a navigation title with the string quotes. Now, really, when this view gets pushed onto the navigation stack, the title bar will be in line instead of this large one. That's now the default. But if we want to see what it really looks like, we can apply that navigation bar title display mode of inline to our preview. And I realized I made an error earlier on. I bound that page text view to the wrong variable. So let me fix that now. With that in place, we can test right in this view, and we can add and edit some quotes. I can add one with a page number, and we see that the date, the quote, and the page number appear in a list row. Subsequent ones get added. If I add one without a page number, the page text field doesn't appear. Now we'll need to provide a way to get this preview from our edit book view. So after the edit book view and below the text editor, I want to create a navigation link. The destination is going to be the quotes list view passing in the book. For the label, I want to display the current count of quotes. So I'll create a constant for that, which will be the book.quotes.count, which is an optional value. So if it is optional, we'll display as 0. Then I can create a label view using the title keys with the string interpolation to display the count, followed by the word quotes, and use a system image of quote.opening. And I'll set the button style to bordered and apply a frame with a max width of infinity and an alignment of trailing to push it to the trailing edge. And I'll add a little bit more horizontal padding. So let me go back to the book list view and the preview and test it out here. Let me select one of the books that I've got here and see that there are 0 quotes. I can tap on the button and let me add 2 quotes, one with a page and another one without. This looks good. The page is only displayed when I have a page number. If I return to Edit Book View, I see that I now have 2 quotes being noted on my navigation link button. Well, let me return to the quotes view and edit one of these quotes and update it. Great. Let me delete one of the quotes, but the swipe. When I return to Edit Book View now, I see I only have 1 quote noted, but I hate that it says 1 quotes. It should say 1 quote, singular. Well, there's a quick fix for this. Where we created our label title key, we can use this that I learned from Paul Hudson. Start the text with a caret, and then surround the title key string with a pair of square brackets. That caret and these square brackets will allow us to apply an inflection rule attribute to this string, and that is inflect true. This then will properly capitalize our word. See now how the quotes are shown with the plural 0 quotes? If I return to Book List View now and test it out, 0 quotes with an S on the book is fine. Perfect. Let me add 1. Now I see it says 1 quote, singular. Let me add another one. And now we see 2 quotes, plural again. All is good. Or is it? To discover this, we'll need to create some quotes in our simulator. So launch that application now. And once launched, tap on one of your books and add a couple of quotes. Select another one and add at least 1 quote for that book as well. Let's stop the application and open your SQL editor for that quote table and go to the Browse Data and count the number of quotes. In my case, I have 3. So let me run the app again and delete one of the books that contained some quotes. I'm going to delete the one that had 2 quotes. When I return to my SQL browser and open that quote table to browse that data again, I'll notice that the records for the book that I deleted weren't deleted. They are now orphaned quotes with no book. Notice that the relationship now back to the book is now null. Remember that book property was optional? Well, it turns out that the default delete rule for a one-to-many relationship is not to cascade the deletes down and remove all related content like the quotes, but rather just to set the related link to null. That's not what I want, but there is a quick fix for this. First, let me manually delete these 2 records here, the orphan ones. I'll return to our book model now, and I'm going to apply a relationship macro to this implicit quotes property. And this will make it explicit, and we can provide a delete rule argument and specify that the delete rule is to cascade instead of the default nullify. Let me run the app once more, and I'm going to delete that second book where I had that single quote, this one here. So once deleted, I'm going to stop the app now and check out my database. When I get to that quotes and browse data, I see that the Cascade delete worked because there are no records left in the quotes table. Well, then in preparation for my next video, I want to make sure that I still have some books in my list with or without comments. And at the beginning, remember I recommended that you back up your store before starting. So I'm going to go back to that backup and replace my store with those files now, so that I'll get all my books back. Now, because all of our changes were made, satisfied all of the conditions for a lightweight migration, the tables will get updated on first launch to add that new quotes table. And here's proof. Well, this completes this tutorial of a one-to-many relationship. In the next video, we're going to introduce the concept of letting a book have a genre, like fiction or nonfiction. But this isn't a one-to-many relationship because each genre can have many books associated with it. It's a many-to-many relationship. So stick with me, and thanks for watching.